for that part. And then Nick, we're going to move forward with your question. And here we'll be dealing with the impact of transfer on locus standi. And then, yeah, so basically there quickly is what happens if one starts an eviction process, and during the eviction process, they would want to then sell the property. So the eviction process here is already in court, right? And now they want to sell the property. Would this person be able to do that? Or is there something they prohibiting them from being able to sell the property?
Perfect. So the one big aspect of this, and we deal with, a lot of clients and a lot of different things happening, and this, having an eviction on a property, while it is absolutely the minority of landlords are going to go through this within their lifetime within property ownership, it is one of those events that is, massively traumatic for you as a homeowner, especially if you've got someone squatting on your property. You have to pay for it. And we do have clients who, unfortunately, if this does happen to them, it sours them towards property ownership entirely. A good deal of our clients who have to go through an eviction process decide that, they don't want this property and they want to get rid of it. It does happen on occasion. And one of the things that's really important, especially when you're in a situation where you have brought an eviction application, is you need to communicate openly with your attorney. Remember, you're already trusting this attorney to canvass your best interests and to assist you as best as they can. And the only way any attorney is going to be able to do this is if you play open cards with them and let them know what is going on. So one of the worst circumstances that we've had is circumstances where, we're in the middle of an eviction proceeding and the client then comes to us and says, by the way, the property, I don't own it anymore. It now belongs to this other person. Okay. This is a situation. If you ambush your attorney with this situation, okay, the consequences are drastic. And I've had it with clients. You have to have very hard conversations about the impact of this transfer. But let's have a look at the impact. So the first thing we've just got to keep in mind is in South African law, there are essentially two ways you can bring an eviction against an unlawful occupier of a property. Okay. The first one is what's called the reivindicatio. Okay. Now the reivindicatio basically says that if I'm the owner of the property, I have the most dominant right in that particular property. And unless there is some counteracting rights, like you've given a tenant a right of lease over a particular property, you have dominion over your property and you can decide what happens with it. So in that sense, when you bring an eviction, you're saying to the court, look, court, I'm the owner of that thing. I can prove my ownership of that thing and I want it back. All right. So there's the reivindicatio. It bases its the strength of your claim on your ownership of the property. Okay. The other way of doing an eviction in South African law is what's called a possessory claim. All right. Now, the possessory claim basically says, well, I have given the right, okay, of possession to someone. All right. So if you enter into a lease agreement, I've given you the right to occupy my property. All right. And that right of occupation, okay, or possession in the circumstances has been taken away. So I'm entitled to my property back. So it's very simple. I've signed a lease agreement with you that says you can possess my property so long as you pay me rental. In the circumstances where you don't pay me rental, I cancel that agreement and that right of possession is now taken away from me. So court, I can now evict them as a result of the lack of their right to possess my property. They are the same in theory when you approach a court. When you approach a court, you're asking for an eviction, but the element of why you're asking for that eviction does change, okay? And the one, as I say, bases itself entirely on ownership of the property. The other one is possession, and the lack of that right to possession taken away, okay? So why does this matter? It matters because we in South African law, we recognize these two different structures. And in terms of our Rental Housing Act, our Rental Housing Act doesn't just say, well, you have to be the owner of a particular property in order to bring the eviction. It says both that you can be the owner or the person who is in control of this particular property. When transfer of a property occurs, okay, you can now start to get an idea of what happens with these particular applications, okay? So in our first instance where we've got an application which is premised upon I am the owner of this property, okay? And because I'm the owner, I'm entitled to get my property back. In circumstances where there's a transfer of the property to another person, I'm sure everyone can now understand there is going to be a problem in your eviction application, okay? Because this property transfers and the ownership aspect, which is what this eviction is based upon, now changes, okay? The entire eviction is disrupted as a result of this, okay? It's absolutely the basis upon which you're bringing this is gone. And any tenants who you are trying to evict in the circumstances, or unlawful occupier that you're trying to evict, is going to be able to go approach a court and say, actually, court, they're not entitled to the relief under the Raven Decatio because their ownership of that particular property has now vanished. And in the circumstances where you are in front of a court on a Raven Decatio, the court is going to agree. You don't have ownership, so you can't ask for the relief anymore. Okay. The possessory claim might be a different circumstances, because if you're basing your claim on the possessory claim, so you have given rights of occupation, you've now taken it, okay, even if that ownership changes, okay, there might still be an ability for the person who is bringing the eviction to continue with the eviction application. But this is where I said at the start, we need to be very careful, okay? That control over a particular property and possession of the particular property can also transfer with ownership of that particular property, and it can disrupt the circumstances. Now, there are clever ways that attorneys can get around this and make sure that if there is already an eviction in court and you're not basing it upon ownership of the particular property, you might be able to continue and still push through to get to your eviction proceeding. And part of this is, for instance, what Bruno was talking about in the last question, where you deal with OTPs. When does possession of a particular property exactly pass to one party? Okay, this is a common clause that's dealt with in an offer to purchase and the transfer of a property. When will you actually have possession? When does it pass? On registration of transfer or immediately? You know, these things are dealt with within your OTP. And it's stuff that you really have to think carefully. If you've already got an attorney who's already sitting in court within an eviction application and you have the intention to sell your property, okay, during this process, make sure you communicate with your attorney. Your attorney is going to have the ability to sit down and go, okay, well, how do we best strategize about us continuing this process so that we don't have an absolute drop of process? And basically, the person who purchases the property from me now has to start from square one again. And when I say square one, I really do mean square one, to the point where, you know, we've had situations where the property transfers during the eviction proceeding. The new owner of that property now has to give notice, okay, to the occupants or the tenant within a property. So it's not even you can start approaching court immediately thereafter. You've now got to give them a month's notice to vacate the premises before you can even start approaching a court. So it's really, there are some serious consequences in the circumstances. Luckily, I'm assuming for purposes of this question, you know, if you've already started an eviction proceeding, I'm hoping you've got an attorney who's assisting you in the circumstances. So speak to them very plainly about this is what the circumstances are. You know, we always, you know, from Bruno and myself, we always advocate that these evictions shouldn't be taking years to complete. Okay, we should be pushing these through on an unopposed basis. These things should be getting through within a matter of months. And it might serve you well to strategize with your attorney to see, well, you know, if we're already sitting in an eviction and our court date is coming up, why don't we hold off? You know, push the transfer just a little bit. You know, it's not great. I know if you want to sell your property, you want to get this through as quickly as possible, but it might save you a lot if you can just hold off the transfer to get the eviction done. Especially in circumstances where, for instance, you know, looking at OTPs, a lot of OTPs have clauses with regards to what kind of state the property is going to be handed over in. And a lot of OTPs say vacant occupation. So, you know, landlords will start the eviction process and then, you know, the transfer goes through. If your OTP says vacant occupation and there's still a tenant in there, you can be in serious trouble with the purchasers. You know, they can claim damages in the circumstances because you haven't given the property in the form that it was agreed upon in terms of the OTP. So please talk very carefully with your attorney. make sure you've got a strategy on how to go forward and how to best not disrupt these proceedings. Both have to happen, but there are ways and tactics that attorneys can use to make sure that you do it in the most efficient way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just something to add on to that. So I know that a lot of attorneys actually watch this show, and there's always going to be a question of, oh, but hold on, I've done many matters where I've been able to remedy locus standi in the middle of court proceedings if something were to go wrong. Yes, but remember evictions, especially because of the legislation that governs how we go about it, it is slightly different. So it's not simply just a court process where you're trying to rectify reivindicatio. We're trying to do it in line with the basically enabling legislation. And the courts have looked at it. So there's case law that, and I mean, it's unfortunate because we've had cases where we were challenging that. We actually went to a full bench, went to the SCA at a stage challenging whether our client would be allowed to, whether we'd be allowed to remedy, this locus standi, the right in law to evict. I mean, we even had an example of a case where at the beginning, we knew that there was going to be a transfer. So, both parties were cited as applicants, and even there, the court was against it. So since then, there's been different things that can be done to try and avoid it. But if we know from the outset, like Nick said, if we know from the outset that there's a potential that a person's going to sell, then it has to be drafted in a very particular way. Otherwise, you may find yourself in trouble selling the property and then the purchaser coming after you, because now all of a sudden they need to do the eviction from scratch. And yeah, that never lands up being a pleasant experience.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Thank you guys. And then obviously, once again, they're touching on the importance of transparency during legal proceedings. So if you are a client and you have trusted an attorney to help you with your matter from professionally, the best thing you can do is obviously be honest with the attorney so that they can help you obviously to the best of their ability. Once you go behind the back and you sort of do things, then you essentially change the merits of the matter, and that completely that the process must now take a different route altogether. And most times you have to be the one as the client who has to pay for that, for that to take a different route. So so thank you guys once again. I think that wraps up today's episodes.
Cool.
Guys, thanks very much, guys. Have a good week.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Yes.
All right. Yes.